War does not always end with noise. Sometimes it ends with silence. In February 1991, much of the world believed the Gulf War was already over. The air campaign had crushed Iraqi defenses. Coalition forces advanced with overwhelming speed. Television anchors spoke of inevitability. Analysts spoke of collapse. On the ground, the feeling was different. The desert stretched endlessly under the night sky, flat and unforgiving. Sand carried the marks of retreating vehicles. The air still held the residue of weeks of bombardment, smoke and heat clinging close to the earth. At night, the desert changed. It became quiet, unnaturally quiet. What history would later summarize as the 100-hour war was not experienced as a single, clean event. It was a series of tense moments where no one knew which encounter would be the last. For Iraqi forces, the order was clear: withdraw. Entire units pulled back under cover of darkness. Some retreated in formation. Others dissolved into scattered columns, hoping distance itself would offer protection. Among them was a division that still believed in its strength: the Hammurabi Division. Elite by Iraqi standards, well-equipped. Once a pillar of Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard. Now it was moving. Late at night, elements of the division, including the 17th Brigade, formed a long armored column. Tanks, armored vehicles, trucks, artillery. They were not advancing. They were escaping, and they believed the worst was behind them. From the ground, it looked like survival. From above, it looked like exposure. Coalition surveillance never stopped. The war might have been ending, but the systems continued to watch. Radar screens revealed movement where none should exist. Thermal sensors detected engines burning brightly in the cold desert night. A column too organized to be ignored. The Hammurabi Division had been found. There was no urgency in the response, no panic, only confirmation. Coordinates were checked, movement analyzed, intent assessed. This was procedure, not emotion. And procedure in modern war is lethal. The decision was simple: do not engage with ground forces. Let the night handle it. AH-64 Apache helicopters were already waiting. They had flown night after night. Crews knew the desert intimately, its stillness and its sudden violence. The Apache was never designed to rush. It was designed to wait. Each aircraft carried sensors that turned darkness into advantage. Infrared vision stripped the desert of its secrecy. Targets emerged clearly, isolated by heat. To the crews, the desert was no longer empty. It was crowded. The Iraqi column continued moving, unaware it was already surrounded by attention. No flares, no warning shots, just quiet preparation. Helicopters lifted off, rotors cutting softly through the air, flying low, invisible. This was not chaos. This was a calculated ending. From their positions, the crew saw everything. Vehicles aligned neatly. Some still used lights, a small detail that revealed everything. They believed the danger had passed. The irony was absolute. At this stage of the war, the soldiers below were not preparing to fight. They were trying to leave. But retreat does not always mean safety, especially when retreat still looks like resistance. The Apaches waited, not impatiently, not emotionally. They waited because they were trained to. Seconds stretched, angles adjusted, orders finalized. Then, without drama, the command came: engage. The desert, silent for hours, was about to remember violence. The desert itself does not know fear. It has witnessed empires rise and collapse, armies cross and vanish, blood sink into sand and disappear without memory. That night, the desert was being used. Above it, the hunters moved. The AH-64 Apache was not built to be seen. It was built to arrive unnoticed and leave nothing standing. Meh. Flying low, the helicopters advanced slowly. No lights, no visible signals. To the naked eye, the night was absolute. To Apache sensors, it was transparent. Through infrared systems, engines burned white. Exhaust spilled into the air. Metal retained heat long after movement slowed. The Iraqi column appeared not as vehicles but as signatures, targets. Each crew worked in calm synchronization. Pilot and gunner shared the same view, a digital landscape of heat and contrast. Every vehicle was measured, evaluated, assigned. Below them, the Hammurabi division kept moving. Tank crews trusted distance. Drivers trusted darkness. Officers trusted that the coalition had already shifted focus elsewhere. None of them looked up. War punishes assumptions. The Apaches slowed further, settling into firing positions. This was not pursuit. This was positioning. Predators do not rush. Quiet confirmations passed between aircraft. Target groups were divided, kill zones defined. From this altitude, the entire column could be controlled. Inside one cockpit, the lead vehicles were tracked. In another, the rear was isolated. High-value targets were marked. The objective was simple: break the column, trap it, remove its ability to respond. There was no shouting, no dramatic countdown. The calm was unsettling. The Apache carried weapons designed for exactly this moment. A GM-114 Hellfire missiles, precision-guided, unforgiving. Each missile knew its target before launch. Gunners waited for perfect alignment. Laser designators locked, systems confirmed. Below, engines idled. Men talked quietly. Some smoked. Invisible lines were already drawn from aircraft to armor. The order to fire came without emotion. The first missile left its rail almost silently. Impact followed. From above, the explosion looked contained, efficient. From below, it was incomprehensible. Before the sound reached the rest of the column, another missile was already in flight. Then another. Then another. The night erupted. Brakes slammed. Vehicles swerved. Formation collapsed. Apaches adjusted instantly. Targets shifted. New designations appeared. This was not a single strike. It was a system executing doctrine. Missiles corrected mid-flight, ignoring smoke and movement. They rarely missed. The Hammurabi division tried to react. Some vehicles attempted to turn around. Others pushed forward blindly. A few fired wildly into the darkness. It changed nothing. The hunters remained above it all. This was not personal. It was overwhelming. Thermal signatures disappeared one by one. Engines went cold, metal burned, then faded. The column unraveled, and the night revealed everything. This was not a warning. It was a conclusion. The desert was no longer silent. It burned. Fire bloomed across the sand in violent flashes. Heat signatures flared, vanished, then reappeared as debris cooled unevenly. From above, the scene looked controlled, almost clinical. From below, it was chaos. The Apaches moved with calm precision, adjusting position by meters. Angles were maintained. Exposure minimized. Hellfire missiles launched in sequence, not all at once, not in panic. Each strike deliberate, each target chosen. The missile cut through the air, guided constantly, correcting itself faster than any human could react. Impact followed. A tank turret lifted briefly before collapsing inward. Armor failed. Another vehicle split open in white heat. The Iraqi column ceased to exist as a formation. Some vehicles attempted to flee. Thermal imaging erased the concept of hiding. Inside the cockpits, there was no celebration, only confirmation tones. Target destroyed. Next, Hydra rockets followed. 70mm saturation strikes tore through clusters of vehicles. Then, the cannon. The 30mm chain gun spoke in short, controlled bursts. Metal, flesh, and sand were torn apart. Discipline below collapsed into panic. Vehicles were abandoned. Men ran with no direction. The desert offered no shelter. One by one, heat signatures faded. Then the numbers mattered. 107 Hellfire missiles fired. 102 direct hits. A statistic so precise it feels unreal. The battlefield confirmed it. Tanks destroyed, armored vehicles burning, artillery silent. An elite division dismantled in less than an hour. The Apaches did not linger. They climbed, repositioned, observed. Violence gave way to quiet. Fires continued to burn. Smoke drifted slowly. Some survivors fled toward the marshlands, hoping water would hide what darkness couldn't. Few would escape. From the air, it no longer looked like a battle. It looked like aftermath. The war was nearly over, but what happened here would be studied for decades. When the last missile was gone, the war did not end with celebration. It ended with silence. Below, the desert no longer moved. What had been a living column was now wreckage scattered across sand. Fire burned in isolated places. Violence had passed. This is the moment rarely shown. After explosions, after statistics, the aftermath. The Hammurabi Division no longer existed as a fighting force. Tanks destroyed or abandoned. Vehicles blackened and twisted. Some soldiers fled toward the marshes seeking concealment. The desert absorbed everything without reaction. Smoke thinned. Heat faded. By morning, the battlefield began erasing itself. The Apache crews confirmed the end and turned away. No cheers. No celebration. Just procedure. The numbers became history. 107 missiles fired, 102 hits. But numbers cannot describe the silence afterward. This was not the largest battle of the war, not the longest, but it was one of the most revealing. It showed what modern war had become: visibility, information, precision. The Apache became more than a helicopter. It became a symbol. The Iraqi forces never saw their attackers, never heard them coming. By the time understanding arrived, it was over. This was not chaos. It was control. Shortly after the ground war ended, the ceasefire was declared. 100 hours. That is how it would be remembered. But within those hours were moments like this one. Quiet. Absolute. Moments where the outcome was decided, not by courage alone, but by systems and discipline. The desert returned to silence. The lesson did not fade. When one side can see everything, strike precisely, and leave untouched, war is no longer about who fights harder. It is about who sees first. And that night, above the sands of Iraq, the future arrived quietly and left nothing behind. What makes this battle difficult to understand is not what happened in the sky. It is what happened on the ground. Because for most of the men in the Hammurabi Division, there was no battle in the traditional sense. There was no enemy advancing, no visible front line, no moment where they raised their weapons and chose to fight. There was only confusion, and then destruction. The first explosions came without warning. No artillery barrage, no preparatory fire. One moment vehicles were moving through the desert. The next, they were burning. Many soldiers never knew what hit them. Some believed they were under air attack from jets. Others thought they had driven into a minefield. A few assumed friendly units had made a catastrophic mistake. Almost none understood the truth. They were being hunted, but not in a way war had ever taught them to expect. In earlier conflicts, danger came from the horizon, from trenches, from visible aircraft overhead. Here, danger came from nowhere, from darkness itself. The helicopters were above them, but unseen. Their sound masked by distance and wind. Their presence erased by night. Even when missiles struck, the source remained invisible. There was nothing to shoot back at. Some tank crews rotated turrets wildly, firing into empty darkness. Others simply froze, waiting for orders that never came. Command vehicles were among the first targets. Leadership vanished in seconds. With communications destroyed, cohesion collapsed. Each vehicle became alone, each crew isolated. This is where modern warfare breaks something fundamental. Courage becomes irrelevant. Training becomes incomplete. Because bravery requires an object, a visible enemy. Here, there was none. Survivors later described the same sensation. Not fear, disbelief. They spoke of explosions appearing out of nowhere, of vehicles vanishing beside them, of fire without sound, then sound without warning. Some never even left their vehicles. Others ran, abandoning machines that moments earlier had represented safety. The desert offered no protection. There were no buildings, no cover, no terrain to hide behind, only open sand and burning metal. This is why the battle ended so quickly. Not because resistance was weak, but because resistance was impossible. The Hammurabi Division had been trained for a different kind of war, one where enemies could be seen, measured, engaged. That night, none of that applied. What confronted them was not force. It was inevitability, and inevitability does not need to fight. It only needs to arrive. The destruction of the Hammurabi Division was not just a battlefield event. It was a collision between eras. On one side, machines designed in the logic of the 1970s, so steel, armor, firepower, a belief that survival depended on thickness, mass, and presence. On the other, a system built around something far less visible: information. The Iraqi tanks that night were not obsolete by accident. They were the product of a doctrine that assumed the battlefield would still be human-scaled, that wars would be fought at distances the eye could understand, that danger would announce itself. The Apache belonged to a different century. Its most powerful weapon was not the missile. It was awareness, the ability to see first, to decide first, to act first. Long before the first Hellfire launched, the outcome had already been determined, not by courage, not by numbers, but by who understood the battlefield sooner. The Hammurabi Division never had a chance to adapt. There was no warning phase, no escalation. One moment they were retreating, the next they were inside a system designed to dismantle them. This is what makes the battle so historically important. It was not just destruction, it was proof. Proof that modern war no longer required proximity, that dominance could be achieved without contact, that the side which controlled information could decide outcomes invisibly. In previous wars, technology had enhanced human capability. Here, it replaced it. The Apache crews did not rely on instinct alone. They relied on sensors, on data streams, on systems that filtered reality into something manageable. To them, the battlefield was not chaos. It was geometry, vectors, ranges, probabilities. To the Iraqi crews below, the battlefield was incomprehensible. This imbalance is what defined the engagement. Not superior firepower, superior perception. The tanks that burned that night were not destroyed because their armor failed. They were destroyed because they were seen too early, because once you are seen, you are already late. This is the quiet revolution that Desert Storm revealed. War no longer began with contact, it began with detection. The Hammurabi Division did not lose because it fought poorly. It lost because it entered a fight that had already ended. By the time the first explosion occurred, every critical decision had been made. This battle forced militaries around the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. You can train soldiers for decades. You can build powerful machines. You can field entire divisions. But if your enemy sees you first, none of that may matter. After the war, analysts would pore over this engagement, not because of its size, but because of its clarity. There were no heroic charges, no prolonged firefights, just efficiency. The Apache did not overpower the Hammurabi Division, it bypassed it. This is where time itself became a weapon, the time it took to detect, the time it took to decide, the time it took to act. Those intervals were measured in seconds, and those seconds decided everything. The Iraqi forces were trapped in a slower loop. Detection came late. Understanding came later. Reaction came last. By then, survival was no longer an option. This is the true legacy of that night. Not the explosions, but the realization that future wars would be won before they were felt, that battlefields would be shaped long before soldiers arrived, that by the time violence became visible, it was already irreversible. The desert did not change that night, but warfare did. The destruction of the Hammurabi Division did not echo only across the desert. It traveled much farther. At the time, very few people understood what had actually happened that night. News reports summarized it in numbers. Analysts mentioned it briefly among dozens of engagements. But inside military institutions around the world, something shifted. Quietly. This was not seen as just another defeat. It was interpreted as a signal, a message sent without words. The message was simple. This is what modern war looks like now. The engagement in southern Iraq demonstrated something that could not be ignored. A fully equipped armored division had been neutralized without a traditional battle. Without air superiority fights, without ground contact, it was over before it was understood. For strategists watching from afar, the implications were unsettling. If an elite unit could disappear this way, what did that mean for everyone else? Armies built around mass and armor began to question their assumptions. Defense planners reconsidered what protection actually meant. Commanders realized that visibility had become vulnerability. The night had rewritten the rules. The Apache was no longer viewed simply as a support platform. It became evidence. Evidence that war had crossed a threshold. This was not about one helicopter or one missile system. It was about integration, sensors, communications, precision weapons, training, all operating as a single organism. The Hammurabi Division had not been defeated by bravery or superior numbers. It had been defeated by a system. And systems scale. That realization spread quickly. Nations that had relied on armored doctrine began investing in countermeasures. Camouflage evolved. Electronic warfare gained urgency. Night operations became essential rather than optional. But the deeper message was psychological. Visibility was no longer mutual. One side could see everything. The other saw nothing. That asymmetry changed how fear worked on the battlefield. Fear used to come from proximity, from the enemy you could hear or see. Now it came from uncertainty, from knowing you might already be targeted, without any sign. This is what made the message so powerful. It wasn't loud. It was undeniable. The Hammurabi Division never broadcast its defeat. There was no surrender ceremony. No final stand captured on camera. It simply ceased to function. And that disappearance spoke louder than any victory parade. Military academies would later study this engagement not for tactics alone, but for meaning. Because this was not just a win. It was a demonstration. A demonstration that deterrence could be achieved through invisibility. That dominance no longer required presence. You did not need to show your strength. You only needed to prove you could apply it without being seen. That is the kind of message that reshapes doctrine. The soldiers on the ground that night never received that message. They were not meant to. The audience was much larger. It included every army still planning for the last war instead of the next one. The desert, silent once more, had become a classroom. And the lesson was brutal in its clarity. The future would not favor those who could endure the most punishment. It would favor those who could decide first and act unseen. There is a moment in every major conflict when war quietly changes its nature. Not announced, not declared, it simply becomes something else. That night in southern Iraq was one of those moments, because what happened there was not just destruction, it was disappearance. An entire division was erased without ever seeing its enemy, without ever understanding the shape of the fight it was in. From that point forward, war no longer required confrontation. It required perception. The men inside the Apache helicopters were not fighting in the way soldiers once had. They were managing information. They saw. They classified. They decided. Violence was the final step, not the first. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience was the opposite. They were inside a war they could not perceive. Explosions arrived without warning. Death came without direction. There was no front line, no clear enemy. Only consequences. This inversion is what made the moment historic. For centuries, war had been built around mutual visibility. Two sides aware of each other, two forces reacting in real time. That symmetry vanished. One side existed in darkness, the other existed in data. And data does not hesitate. This is the uncomfortable truth that emerged from the desert. Technology did not make war more chaotic. It made it quieter, more efficient, more distant. Decisions were no longer shaped by emotion in the moment. They were shaped by preparation, systems, and training long before contact. The Apache crews did not improvise that night. They executed. And execution left no space for resistance. From that moment on, invisibility became power. Not stealth for survival, stealth for dominance. To be unseen was no longer to hide. It was to control. This changed how wars would be planned, how armies would be built, how soldiers would be trained. It also changed how wars would feel. For those on the receiving end, conflict would arrive suddenly, without warning, and end just as abruptly. For those delivering it, war would become procedural, a series of confirmations, a checklist, a sequence. The human element did not disappear. It moved. It shifted away from the battlefield and into planning rooms, training simulations, and doctrine manuals. Courage still mattered, but it mattered earlier. Discipline still mattered, but it mattered invisibly. The desert returned to silence after the helicopters departed. Wreckage cooled. Smoke dispersed. Sand reclaimed the scars. Nothing in the landscape revealed how significant the moment had been. But history noticed, because from that night forward, wars would increasingly be decided before soldiers ever met, before shots were exchanged, before fear had time to form. They would be decided by who understood the battlefield first, who could see without being seen, who could act without being challenged. The Hammurabi Division never understood that shift. They were caught in the transition between eras, between a war that could be faced and a war that could not. That is why this moment endures. Not because of the explosions, not because of the numbers, but because it marked the point where war stopped announcing itself. It became something that arrived quietly, decided quickly, and vanished without explanation. The future did not roar into existence that night. It whispered, and by the time the world heard it, everything had already changed.